Presidents Ahmadinejad and Obama both said killing his own citizens was unacceptable. But now the US has it out at Iran, saying the United States and the world will continue to bear witness to the Iranian government's blatant violation of the universal rights of its citizens and its ongoing hypocrisy. Iranians deserve the same justice and rights that their government extols the virtue of abroad. Meanwhile, two Iranian opposition leaders under unofficial house arrest since February have reportedly been abducted. A human rights group says Mahdi Karoubi and 2009 presidential candidate Mir Hossein Mousavi are in great danger. Jordan's Prime Minister is promising to introduce new political reforms after the opposition threatened more demonstrations. It comes as supporters of King Abdullah held a show of solidarity in the capital Amman. The rally follows weeks of nationwide protests by the opposition. Its leaders say the country's pace of reform has been too slow. Thousands of people marched through the capital of Bahrain in a demonstration against the monarchy. Protesters have rejected the king's appeal for dialogue and calling for him to step down. The impasse is entering its third week. The demonstrators' demands include free elections and the release of more political prisoners. 4 people have died in bomb attacks that forced the closure of Iraq's largest oil refinery. The blast sparked a huge fire at the site north of Baghdad, in an area which was once an al-Qaeda stronghold. Iraq's oil minister says it hit only one production unit. Iraq's oil products are only used for domestic power generation and consumption and are not exported. Officials in Egypt unveiled the first proposed political reform since the revolution. While they allow new political parties, restrictions on the participation of the Muslim Brotherhood have not been lifted. Anita McNaught reports now from Cairo.
As emotions subside on Tahrir Square, the business of making change happen for all Egyptians has begun. The Egyptian constitution perpetuated the country's draconian emergency laws and consolidated power in the hands of the former president. This committee of legal experts was tasked by Egypt's temporary rulers, the military, with proposing reforms to 6 articles. They tackled 11. But one controversial paragraph remains untouched, Article 5, that prohibits parties with religious affiliations from standing in elections. One of the committee members is with the Muslim Brotherhood, the party most affected by this exclusion. Far from being concerned about the omission, he believes it was too contentious for them to touch.
It's a flawed article, but we didn't want to amend any article that had an ideological dimension. We're leaving that to an elected committee.
But political analyst Gamel Sultan doesn't think this law will pose an obstacle to the Muslim Brotherhood in the future.
It is not about the text itself. It's about the context within which this text is going to be interpreted. And I think the current and the future context will be much more tolerant vis-à-vis the Muslim Brothers.
Egypt's popular revolution threw up a new generation of progressive political activists, the hope of a vibrant and reinvigorated country, a break with the past. But critics of these first tentative steps say the march to new elections is going too fast, with these new players not given the time to form parties. And they warn the constitutional reforms don't go far enough. They don't secure a place for the new voices. They may even entrench the old ones.
This is a system that is likely to create or to allow a bigger chance for the Muslim Brothers plus the NDP to dominate the new parliament. It looks like some sort of a deal is there, a sort of a deal at the expense at the new, modern, secular, social and political forces.
The people of Egypt are impatient for change. If they find 6 months down the track that the revolution has merely delivered a new version of the old order, some of these people are going to be seriously disappointed. Anita McNaught, AlJazeera, in Tahrir Square, Cairo.
Well, we can now talk with Tamer Mustafa in Vancouver. He's an associate professor in international studies at Simon Fraser University. Thanks so much for joining us. What do you think? Do these proposed amendments put the democratic process back on track?
Well, I don't know that there was a democratic process that was on track, but this is a beginning. Article 76, the proposed amendment to Article 76 of the Constitution, really does open up, for the first time, probably a genuine multi-candidate presidential election. The threshold for entry and for candidacy is much easier to achieve, and so we will probably see a multi-candidate election. Additionally, the proposed amendment to Article 88 guarantees full judicial supervision of elections. That's another good change that was made, that is being proposed. And finally, Article 148 of the Constitution, which governs the emergency law, now will make it more difficult for the regime to impose an emergency rule, at least on paper.
All right, granted, those are the pluses.
These are
what do you
positive
make
changes.
of some of the alleged minuses that the NDP, National Democratic Party, which used to run the country, would still be left with perhaps too much influence in organising the vote? There's not enough constitutional guarantees that foreign and independent monitors will be allowed to operate. What do you make of criticisms like that?
I think that's an excellent point. You know, one of the points of caution that I've been sort of urging is that constitutional changes are absolutely essential, but there is a whole lot of illiberal legislation that still is on the books that deals with the nitty-gritty of organizing elections and giving powers to the Ministry of Interior and so on and so forth. Those laws need to be changed, and there needs to be enabling legislation that will assist in the process, that will guarantee real free and fair elections. So part of what the Constitutional Reform Committee is charged with doing is to issue this new enabling legislation, and that's going to be the most important thing for us to keep our eyes on in the coming weeks, to make sure that these constitutional commitments are now going to be followed through with the actual details of how this election process is going to be played out.
Then does it really matter if it's not 100% perfect at this point, since it is just a temporary constitutional amendment, isn't it, just to get through elections, and then supposedly after that drawing up a brand new constitution from scratch?
Yes, well, part of the package of reforms that have now been put on the table entails basically short-term amendments to the Constitution, but then also setting up a process for adopting essentially a brand new Constitution, having a constitutional convention to start essentially from scratch. Now, what's really critical is that we have free and fair elections before we get to that process, right? Because if we do not have a representative People's Assembly, if we do not have a president that's elected in a free and fair election, then we're not going to get a complete rewriting of the Constitution that sets up the proper rules of the game. And this goes back to the other question that you just asked concerning international monitoring. It's absolutely critical that we keep the pressure on the military to have free, fair elections, and international monitoring, and also domestic Egyptian human rights groups, of which there are many, play a very significant role in making sure that this stays a legitimate process.
Let's hope for the best. From Vancouver, Tamer Mustafa. New Zealand will begin to bury victims of the earthquake on Monday. At least 148 people were killed in last week's quake in Christchurch. 50 more are still unaccounted for. The dead and missing include 20 people from 20 nations. The first burial service is planned for a 5-month-old victim. In Chile, thousands of people gathered to mark 1 year since a massive earthquake struck the country. Thousands of families are still living in temporary shelters. President Sebastián Pinera has been facing growing criticism over the speed of the reconstruction. AlJazeera's Mark Orchard reports.
A pre-dawn vigil at the epicenter of the magnitude 8.8 earthquake. The keynote to a national day of mourning for all the victims and their families. In the coastal town of Constitución, bells tolled and the names of the dead were read out.
To be here along with all the other families is incredibly painful. Incredible, but you need to know how to stand up.
President Sebastián Pinera has been touring the disaster zone with the message that his government is sparing no expense to rebuild.
As we observe the first anniversary of the catastrophe which struck our country, the reconstruction has been solid, and we have achieved very significant progress and accomplishments.
The country's main highways are nearly back to what they were before the quake. But building new housing for the displaced has been slower. In this camp, residents who lost all their possessions are still waiting for a grant to build a new neighborhood.
We are suffering here. We don't have water for the house. The truth is that there's been a lot of shamelessness here. That's the only way to describe it.
We are all suffering from depression here. This is going nowhere.
Opposition politicians blame the lack of progress on the right-of-centre government's decision to privatise most of the construction work.
The government cannot continue to accept poor workmanship in the service of the public. The methods they have been employing in the Biobío region are absolutely outside the law and public morality.
Pinera concedes that the work is running behind schedule, but his government says it will accelerate the outsourcing of work to private companies. Mark Orchard, Al Jazeera.
Let's move to Malaysia now, where the government is planning to tighten media regulations. They'll put limits on the internet as well, raising concerns of a crackdown on the freedom of speech. Stephanie Scowen reports.
It's the kind of news no publisher wants to hear. A planned newspaper boycott in support of free speech in Malaysia. Campaigners say if the plan to change the Printing Presses and Publications Act and the Sedition Act goes ahead, it will shackle the last vestige of press freedom in the country.
Free press in this country, I mean, the idea of free press is most of us don't feel there is such a thing as free press in that sense.
The editor of independent news portal Malaysia Kini, which is frequently critical of the government, fears the worst.
When the guidelines have been set, when the confusion has been sorted out, I see, perhaps a major crackdown against online, commentators, including, websites like Malaysia Kini.
Malaysia Kini is one of the few media outlets to take up the case of journalist Hatta Wahari. A reporter for government-backed paper Utusan Malaysia, Wahari was suspended in January for comments he made as president of the NUJ.
I'm issuing a statement that please go back to the press freedom, please do a non-biased reporting and non-partisan, that we go back to our main objective, to disseminate information to the people. We should not be a propaganda tool to any stakeholder.
Some fear the expansion of the PPPA and the Sedition Act is part of a government strategy to win back seats at the next election. Others warn a crackdown will stifle Malaysia's development and say the government needs to change tack.
If Malaysia wants to be a developed nation, it comes with democratic rights and freedom of expression. You can have a high-income economy and restrict the others.
Al Jazeera asked Utusan Malaysia to explain why it was taking action against Wahari, but the paper declined to comment. Disciplinary proceedings against him have been indefinitely postponed, but Wahari remains suspended from his job. The plan to regulate the internet is a major U-turn for the government, which previously said it would never interfere with the World Wide Web. It says, though, it must now respond to threats to national security. But just exactly what those threats are, critics say, is anyone's guess. Stephanie Scowen, Al Jazeera, Kuala Lumpur.
Well, the 83rd Annual Academy Awards ceremony is underway in Hollywood. It's another exciting year for the great and good of the film industry. The King's Speech is up for 12 nominations, including Best Picture and Best Actor. Other films expected to do well are The Social Network, Black Swan and Toy Story 3. This is Al Jazeera, and these are the stories making the headlines now. The UN has unanimously voted to impose immediate sanctions on the Libyan regime. It comes as anti-Gaddafi protesters close in on the capital, Tripoli, but there are remaining pockets of pro-Gaddafi camps scattered across the country. The Libyan leader is defiant, saying he won't leave. Reports from western Libya say troops loyal to Gaddafi are preparing for a counter-offensive in the city of Zawiya, the city's centre currently in the hands of anti-Gaddafi forces. These are the latest pictures from the city, just 50 kilometres west of the